It is time now for Money Power Politics. And boy, was it a rough day for the markets. The president's growing feud with Europe over the fate of Greenland plunged stocks deep into the red. So let's just level set. Whether or not you're invested, that doesn't matter. I just want to level set with exactly what is going on here. Over the last year, Trump has made tariffs his signature economic policy. He claims we need them to restore America's manufacturing dominance. But since Liberation Day, manufacturing has not come roaring back. In fact, we lost 68,000 manufacturing jobs in this last year, and inflation, while improving, has not gone away either. But that has not stopped the president from now threatening new to 8 European nations with 10% tariffs if they do not agree to hand over Greenland, or from threatening France with 200% tariffs on wine if they refuse to join Trump's Board of Peace. And this tells us something really important about how Trump uses tariffs, not as a tool to improve the lives of the American business, worker, people, but as a weapon against his adversaries. It is true that there is growing optimism that our economy will do well this year, but that is in spite of tariffs, I promise you, not because of them. And hope for growth could just fly out the window if Trump actually goes through with these tariff threats. And Europe, maybe, possibly, fights back, actually bites back, which they could do this time. I just want you to go back to Liberation Day. Why did Trump back off those giant tariffs? It was not over concern for the American people or calls he got from world leaders or business leaders. No, it was the bond market. Treasury bonds were on the verge of spiking borrowing rates, which would have put a lid on economic growth. And we are not reaching those levels yet, but bond yields are rising, and it is starting to feel like deja vu all over again with these new trade war threats. And while Trump is calculating that our NATO allies could not hold a candle to our military might, they have no leverage. If investors in all those countries stopped buying and dumped their holdings of U.S. Treasuries, it would be a brutal blow. Ron Insana, veteran financial journalist and publisher of The Message of the Markets on Substack, is here, and Bharat Ramamurthy, former National Economic Council deputy director and author of The Bully Pulpit on Substack. Okay, Bharat, the president has slapped a lot of tariffs on a lot of countries. Why might this one be different?
Well, I'm not sure it's going to be different. It's going to be the same outcome that we've been seeing this whole time, where costs for American consumers go up on things like French wine, if you enjoy some Pinot Noir in the evening. And you're also seeing the possibility, the very real possibility of retaliatory tariffs from Europe this time around, which could mean that everything from Harley-Davidson motorcycles to Boeing aircraft to Kentucky bourbon are all going to be slapped with tariffs, and that could have a direct impact on workers in those industries. So you keep coming back to the question, what is this all for? Right? I think Americans are willing to live with some temporary pain if they see a clear goal at the end of all of this. And the goal right now appears to be trying to take over Greenland, something that 87% of the American public opposes and only 4% of the public supports. So you're imposing pain on the American people for an end that nobody in the American public actually supports. And in the same time, alienating a lot of our allies. And we might get to this later, but I think the most remarkable thing that we've seen over the last couple of days has been Mark Carney, Prime Minister of Canada's speech at Davos, where he basically said, we can't count on the United States anymore. It's time for us to look elsewhere, including to China.
Today, legendary investor Ray Dalio warned that this tariff war could turn into something many of us have never heard of, a capital war. Right? I mentioned it at the top with these European countries dumping U.S. assets. Right? Within hours, we saw a Danish pension fund announce that they were going to sell $100 million worth of U.S. treasuries. What was the reasoning? Poor government and finances. Okay? Could we see more of this? Because this is a huge, Pete Hegseth wants to say, nobody's got military like we do, but they hit the sell button, that hurts.
Yeah, and I think, Steph, it would be a three-step process. Europe has warned that they could put tariffs on $108 billion worth of American-made goods. They could then go through what they call their trade bazooka, which is effectively a trade embargo on a wide variety of U.S. products that go to Europe. Then there is the nuclear option. Europe, on a combined basis, owns over $3.5 trillion worth of our treasury bonds, which is roughly 10% of our national debt. If they were to sell that in unison, and that is, by the way, not a prediction, but it is a risk. it would not just send interest rates soaring, it would send the dollar spiraling lower, it would crash the stock market, and it would lead to a recession in the economy if you were to follow the typical economic logic that goes along with a maneuver like that. And so that nuclear option would be the scariest of the three. Even the bazooka, if they were to pull it out and create an embargo, would effectively set the stage for potentially a global recession.
Bharat, what do you think about that?
I think it's realistic. And I should say, you talked about this. We're already starting to see some action in the bond market. The 10-year rate is up over the last 24 hours. Maybe part of that is what's going on in Japan. But I think a lot of it is uncertainty, geopolitical uncertainty caused by the Trump administration. And people sitting at home may say, why do I care? I'm not investing in the bond market. The 10-year rate is really the key rate when it comes to mortgage rates in the United States. And so over the past 2 weeks, you've seen the Trump administration throwing everything at the wall when it comes to housing affordability, a ban on institutional investors, talking about a 50-year mortgage before that. But at the same time, all of their actions are pushing up the 10-year rate, which is actually pushing upward on mortgage prices. So it's all an anti-affordability agenda for people in the United States. All of these actions are pushing up prices for American consumers, again, for no particular end.
Then isn't he just hurting his own affordability push? Like tomorrow in Davos, he's supposed to talk about housing, affordable housing in the United States of America. But on top of that is this Greenland situation that's causing mortgage rates to go up.
Yeah, and as was alluded, there's some strange things going on in the Japanese bond market where interest rates are spiking. That's having an effect on global bond markets, driving our yields up, as well as some of this other turmoil that we're seeing. Davos is a very strange place to have a domestic affordability conversation. If you've
of
ever
all the
been,
things to talk about, the fact that he's doing that there is amazing to me.
Yeah, and I don't think there isn't a single policy right now that for the long run would promote affordability in the housing market. They've not talked about increasing supply of available housing. They've not talked about doing anything else that would allow people to, access residential real estate in a meaningful way. Some of these things are really at the margin. They're not the types of things that are drivers of home affordability. Home prices are up almost 50% from the pre-pandemic levels. A lot of this is a structural problem that the administration and quite frankly, U.S. states individually and localities have failed to address.
All right, Bharat, new topic. Jerome Powell is expected to attend Supreme Court arguments over Trump's effort to fire Fed Governor Lisa Cook. What are you expecting?
Well, I think that he's going to have a hard time in court. Everything that we've seen from the Supreme Court so far suggests that they're pretty skeptical of Trump's ability to fire Fed board members without cause. And I think that's in part because of the structure of the Fed. But I also think, to be honest, the Supreme Court is concerned about the economic implications of allowing the president to have direct control over the Fed, which is what they would have if they could fire any board member, including the chair, whenever they wanted. We've seen lots of good historical research, lots of research from other countries showing that when politicians can directly control interest rates, it tends to lead to much higher inflation over time. And that's not an outcome that anybody wants, particularly in the United States.
Yeah, I'm not a constitutional scholar, but I doubt that enters into their considerations. I think it's really going to be very specifically whether or not the president has the power to remove anyone from a body that's, like the Fed, considered to be a quasi-independent entity over which the president does not have that particular authority. Whether or not they consider the economic implications, I think, might be a reach for them. And that would also then affect Jay Powell's tenure and whether or not he could be removed prematurely before May of this year. And that would put the Supreme Court in an entirely different place. They would be granting the president the right to set interest rate policy implicitly.